Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adina Levin, and I am co-founder of both Seamless Bay Area and before that, Friends of Caltrain, which are nonprofits seeking to see a successfully modernized Caltrain in the context of a regionally integrated public transportation system that is accessible to all. And we're here at a really pivotal moment in history where Caltrain is like other systems that look kind of like Caltrain that we're going to be learning about, is a system that was formerly conceived of as a commuter rail service. We're going to learn a little bit about the history of what that means. And as impacted by the pandemic, services that look like Caltrain were really hard hit. You can see this is the ridership recovery from the San Francisco Bay Area, where overall ridership in the Bay Area is up between 50 and 60% and gradually increasing. And the backbone rail services, BART is climbing toward 50%, so still very significantly depressed from before the pandemic. And Caltrain, where trains were just incredibly packed, and if you wanted to get onto the train, you had to be packed like a sardine and sitting on the stairs. The ridership is now back up to 39%. The trains aren't empty anymore, but that is still a significantly lower ridership than before the pandemic. And there's really an important need to transform the system in order to be able to adapt to a post-pandemic future. So fortunately, with Caltrain, there's an exciting electrification project that is happening that's been in the works for many years and is finally going to be providing passenger service in the fall of 2024. And it's going to enable faster, more frequent, more environmentally friendly, less polluting, less noisy service that has the opportunity to help with the transition that we are going to talk about today. And here to help us with this conversation about how Caltrain and services like it have the opportunity to adapt in a post-pandemic world is Chistof Spieler, who's a public transportation expert, former board member at Houston Metro, and author of Trains, Buses, and People, an opinionated atlas of U.S. transit. We'll be hearing expertise laced with very informed opinions. We have Sandy Johnston, who's a deputy director of regional transportation planning at the MBTA in Boston, and is also an expert in the history of U.S. commuter rail. So we'll get some context on how the systems that we know today came to be and what that means for the potential for change. And we are also joined by Giselle Hale, who is former mayor of Redwood City, a city that is located on the center of the Caltrain line that's been in place for 150 years, and a city that's organizing its future around the rail and transit system. And Giselle is currently a leader in many initiatives around climate and housing for the future of our region and state, country, and world. Before we are done, we will talk about some of the decisions that are going to be made coming up in the Bay Area, and maybe touch a little bit around the state of California and how those decisions are going to affect the potential for the transformation that does need to be at hand. And with that, I'm going to turn this over. So we're going to hear from the different panelists, and then we will have some Q&A and discussion among the panel. and then we will open it up to audience questions. Please do use the Q&A feature, and we will take the questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Chistof Spieler.
Sounds great. You need to stop sharing so I can share. Okay, I'm really happy to be here to talk about commuter rail. I just saw this sign posted on a station in Boston last week, and it felt very fitting because what we're talking about here today is a kind of transit technology that has also been used in a very particular way in the United States. And I would argue that the way we use this is not at all inherent to the technology, but we've made a series of assumptions for what commuter rail should be. And if you look around the country, you'll see some very clear patterns. Generally, commuter rail service is infrequent. Here we are in Elizabeth, New Jersey, 7 minutes to Newark Airport, 13 minutes to Newark, 33 minutes to New York, high density, high demand. But if you're standing on that platform, you may be waiting up to 40 minutes in the middle of the day for a train. You can see actually how irregular that service also is. The trains don't run all day. A lot of times commuter rail runs at peak only, or weekend or evening service isn't very good at all. Here you're in Fullerton, California. Last train into LA will leave at 5:48 p.m. If you're working in downtown LA and want to get home, last train of the day leaves 6:52. You want to stay for drinks after work, that service won't be there for you. And in addition, that service tends to be very complex. This is out of Philadelphia, SEPTA, the Lansdale-Doylestown line, before COVID, 30 different stopping patterns. Every train stops at a different set of stations. And if you don't understand the schedule well, you may find that train skips the place you're trying to go to entirely. We tend to have these very complex service patterns. We also have high fares. Typically in the United States, commuter rail fares are significantly higher than the fares in the areas around them. Here you can see the cost to ride SEPTA to Center City. It's $2 on a bus. If you're riding from the same places on regional rail, it might be $5 or more. And these systems really aren't integrated with other transit. You look at downtown Chicago, for example, what you're seeing here is commuter rail stations and L stations, and they're not next to each other. They're not connected. So we're really not set up for these transfers between commuter rail and other transit modes, either in downtowns or elsewhere along the line. We can look at the missed connections along the Caltrain line, for example, for places where that's happening. And overall, we're also running very inefficient operations. We have stations which are simply not designed to handle large volumes of passengers efficiently. This is the Northeast Corridor in Philadelphia. There's full speed Acela trains going by here, but people are boarding from low-level platforms, walking across another track. There's no wheelchair accessibility here. When there's a lot of people boarding, it'll take a very long time to board that train. And it takes a very large crew to operate a service like that, because as you see, you need conductors standing next to the doors. In general, the way we use commuter rail actually leads to a lot of inefficiencies. Here we're sitting in Vancouver. You can see the SkyTrain, which is an all-day urban subway line, and the commuter rail train next to it. That SkyTrain train is going to make 11 round trips over the course of the day. It's going to run from early in the morning to late at night. That commuter rail train next to it, that makes one round trip a day. The train runs in the morning, waits in downtown Vancouver all day, runs out in the evening. That's incredibly inefficient use of equipment. And as noted, this becomes all the more important because the ridership hasn't come back. Compared to other transit modes in particular, we're seeing much lower ridership return on commuter rail because that core market isn't there. And what's frustrating about that inefficiency is commuter rail isn't inherently expensive to operate. If you take a look at the cost to move a seat a mile on commuter rail, it's actually significantly cheaper than moving a seat a mile on a bus. But we're moving so many empty seats, and that we are simply operating these incredibly inefficiently. And those empty seats could have people in them. I would argue that we're leaving lots of people behind on our existing commuter rail networks. We're leaving people behind in the cores of our cities. This is Wayne Junction in Philadelphia. Nice, fast, pretty frequent service right into Center City. This will be faster for you than taking the bus. There's no subway station nearby, but we're only getting 375 boardings a day. And that's because, as Sandy will talk about, this service wasn't designed to serve the people in this neighborhood. So we have this huge potential there. We've got potential out in small towns and suburbs. This is Frederick, Maryland. And as you can see, the station is a bus hub and there is commuter rail right there, but there's only 3 trains a day. So there's a lot of people who want to make that trip and there's no service for them. And commuter rail serves lots of places that aren't major job centers. You could go to the beach in Oceanside, for example. It's only 3 blocks from the station, but the commuter rail service isn't there all day for you to use it for those kind of trips either. So how did we end up with this? Sandy's going to talk a lot more about this, but fundamentally, agencies inherited this. The way we run commuter rail goes back well over a century. They're using infrastructure that was built for a certain kind of service. We have regulatory structures that tend to treat commuter rail differently than other kinds of transit. And there's also a lot of politics behind this. I think it's difficult to talk about commuter rail without mentioning race, that a lot of these decisions were explicitly designed to prevent suburban commuters from mixing with residents of the cities. And obviously, the people who ride commuter rail, the people for whom it works, actually tend to be very well-connected and influential people. And that obviously affects these politics. But I would not minimize something else, which is that a lot of the issues here is how we think about commuter rail. And the assumption has been that if we want to provide better transit service, commuter rail is not the technology that can do it. This is in Boston, a low ridership commuter rail line converted into a high ridership light rail line. Is that ridership high because it's a different mode of transit? No, that ridership is high because the service is better. But what we've done in the United States is built a lot of new lines from scratch to serve the kind of corridors commuter rail could serve. BART is essentially a commuter rail system in terms of its regional reach, but built from scratch using a different technology. And in places like Boston, we've actually built parallels to commuter rail lines using other modes, essentially replicating, duplicating a lot of infrastructure, because we felt if we wanted frequent service, that needed to be a subway. And meanwhile, on the commuter rail system we've tended to focus on replacing equipment, building new shops, but not really modernizing what kind of service it is, running the same service with better equipment. And even new systems like ACE in the Bay Area, very much designed for that same 9-to-5 market. But if we look around the rest of the world, commuter rail can be something very different. Look at Japan, for example. After World War II, a really comprehensive modernization of that railroad system, better equipment, better stations, better infrastructure, a much looser attitude towards how transit and commuter rail go together. If you board a subway train in Tokyo, some of those will actually continue on to a commuter rail line on their outer end. Some really extraordinary levels of service. If you look here at the Yamanote line, the busiest commuter rail line in the world, they're running 4-minute peak headways using commuter rail technology. If you go to a place like the UK, there's long been a tradition of these kind of trains serving much more urban markets. The way they operate their railroad system in general is designed much more for all-day service. It's designed much more for being able to handle the variety of loads you get over the course of a day. And in London, they've put real effort into improving service and rebranding some of these lines in what they call overground, gotten some really amazing results from that. Here you can see service patterns as well as other changes on the Gospel Barking Oak line. As you can see here, they more than quadrupled ridership on the same line with better branding, better integration, and new trains, and most importantly, frequent service. And probably some of the best examples of how to do this are in Germany. This is the S-Bahn in Munich. built in the 70s in time for the Olympics. And the marquee feature here was a new downtown tunnel. They were able to take a bunch of trains which formerly terminated in downtown, link them through downtown in a new tunnel and through run them. But that's actually, to me, not the most important feature. That did mean that the trains now stop directly under downtown Munich. Incidentally, this is a 2-track commuter rail station that carries as many riders as New Jersey Transit and Long Island Railroad combined, bringing into New York's Penn Station. But there was a lot more to this. There was a full integration of a network, thinking about that commuter rail line as a new kind of service, which was really part of the urban transit service, which had trains that were designed to function much more like subway trains than they function like commuter rail trains. And that had integrated connections to other transit. Here you can catch a streetcar in downtown Munich, and the escalator to the commuter rail station goes directly from the streetcar platform, with a full integration of fares across the entire network. Everything within that blue bubble, your cost to ride transit from point A to B costs the same, regardless of what mode you use, regardless of how many transfers you use, and regardless of what agency is operating that service. Their base frequency for all-day service in Munich is a train every 20 minutes, which is represented by that orange. In red, you can see in the core, they end up with headways as good as a train every 2 minutes. You compare that to the United States, to places like Chicago, to places like Boston, and here you're seeing the best we get in Chicago, for example, is one line that hits 20 minutes, a couple ones in green that hit 30, and everything else is less. Here's Philadelphia. Even New York City, there's not a single corridor in New York City where you get commuter rail every 15 minutes or better. And that shows up in the ridership. I love this comparison of Munich to Philly. Munich is less than half the size as a metropolitan area. It has a commuter rail system of almost exactly the same size. And then look at the difference in your ridership. That is 5 times the ridership on the Munich S-Bahn as Philadelphia gets. And I would actually argue Philadelphia's land use is actually better positioned to get high ridership than Munich's is. So I'd say the formula here, if we really want to turn commuter rail systems into that kind of high ridership, useful transit service, is number 1, frequent, simple all-day service. Number 2, full fare integration. Number 3, connections with local transit. And number 4, stations and trains built for fast, accessible boarding. And all of this has been done in the United States. Denver is running commuter rail every 15 minutes through the open prairie on the way to the airport. Dallas has had from the beginning integrated fares between commuter rail and light rail and local bus. Salt Lake City is building bus hubs around its stations. New lines like Tex Rail in Fort Worth have that kind of level boarding with modern trains. And we are starting to see some cities look at really rethinking their systems. This is actually a project that I'm very proud to be project manager on, reimagining regional rail in Philadelphia, where we're looking at what could this system be? And what we're seeing here is an opportunity to more than double ridership on the network, because we have huge opportunities here if you look across the United States. Places like New York, here's the commuter rail lines and the underlying density. There is huge trip demand in these corridors where we already have infrastructure and could run better service. And clearly one of those corridors is Caltrain, which basically runs up the peninsula, right where all of the people are, and could become the transit spine for that whole corridor, not just a way that 9 to 5 commuters get to work. So I think we have a choice in front of us on where we go with these networks. And if we try to maintain the status quo, I think the post-COVID answer to where do we go is we'll actually see these systems decline, as it will be impossible to justify continuing running the current service. If instead we transform them to make them more useful to more people, then I think we can have much higher ridership, and that becomes obviously a much easier proposition to justify. So I really would argue we need to stop thinking in terms of modes. We need to start thinking in terms of how these services fit into a regional network. Caltrain can be a kind of BART. They can function the same way regionally, regardless of what the underlying technology is. And with that, looking forward to the other presentations and looking forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I have some follow-up questions that we'll take with the panel. If you attending have questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll take them at the end. And we will go to Sandy Johnston, who will talk to us a little bit about how this strange situation came to be. How did we get here? Where did this come from?
Thank you, Adina. Just give me 1 second to get my PowerPoint set up here. All right. Can folks see my slides? I need to click share. There we go. All right. Can folks see that?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So thank you, Chistof, for that terrific overview and introduction. And I just want to say I basically agree with everything Chistof said. I want to take this opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into kind of how things got to be the way they are in this country, in ways that hopefully explain a little bit about what Caltrain and the kind of Bay Area planning context have confronted. I'm afraid this is going to be a little bit more wordy than Chistof. I don't have his photography skills, but I hope it'll still be entertaining and interesting. So just a little bit about me. I work in strategic planning for the MBTA here in Boston. I'm appearing here very much in a personal capacity today. I wrote my master's thesis for grad school about why, essentially trying to answer the question that Chistof posed of like, why hasn't the US followed the path that basically every other developed country that has a significant rail network followed in terms of modernizing urban, suburban, regional rail. I write a blog and I'm on Twitter a lot for as long as that lasts. So I want to start by posing a question. Just so if you can look at the picture on the screen, what we have here is a bi-level electric multiple unit train stopped at a high-level platform. And you probably can't see it so well in this picture, but this is a rail line that actually runs right down the middle of a street. And I want folks to put in the chat kind of how often would you guess a train with these characteristics, that is electrified, high-level platforms for level boarding that runs in the middle of a mixed-use street in a dense urban area comes. If you're familiar with this operation, please don't ruin it for everybody else. So I'm going to wait just 1 second, let people think about that a little bit. All right, so the answer is this operation. This is, for those who don't know it, Metra's South Chicago branch of the electric division. Operates at most every 20-ish minutes, and the ish is important, in the peak direction, and every hour off peak on weekdays and hourly all day on weekends. That's actually a slight improvement from where it has been sometimes, but it hasn't always been that way. And if it's surprising, and I think it should be surprising that a line with these characteristics in this kind of built environment would run that infrequently, I'm going to argue that's because what I like to call the ideology of North American commuter rail. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that ideology and where it comes from. And hopefully that will shed some light on kind of why modernizing Caltrain has been such a struggle. Very brief history. I'm not going to bore you to death by covering in great depth, but really quickly, in the idea of commuter rail as a term really goes back to the 1830s. So right around the origins of rail in this country. The first systems come online in 1829, 1830. And by 1834, 1835, you're seeing people talk about commutation. That is kind of cutting fares for regular riders. And in general, that is along the lines of gentlemen coming from their country estates in places like Boston or the main line of Philadelphia into the city on a semi-regular basis. And they get a discount in return for being a regular rider of the railroad. And I don't know exactly which was the first operation to do this. I've seen it variously cited to different places. It doesn't really matter. From there until about 100 years later, up until about 1930, this develops, and from about 1900 to 1930, the railroad historian George Hilton calls that the golden age of commuter rail. That was when ridership was the highest. There were not great alternatives, but the suburbs were developing rapidly enough that even people who were, even at that time, buying cars to keep it at home would ride the train into work in the big city. After World War II, which is a kind of a temporary reprieve, the commuter rail, which had been up to that point privately operated for profit, fall into the real crisis because the government is building freeways and the trains are starting to become decrepit and disinvested. They're no longer profitable, in many cases very unprofitable. And so what you eventually get is starting from the 1960s and all the way into the 1980s, gradually the public sector takes over operation of the remaining operations. Many of them, some of them are abandoned, others have a variety of subsidy operations or contracted operations, but in one way or another, the public sector takes them over. More recently, as Chistof alluded to, we've seen a few new build systems that have still mostly followed this emphasis on 9 to 5 commuting in the last 20, 30 years. And I would argue in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a kind of renewal of interest in what we might call regional rail, which is actually serving a broader market. So one of the things that I discovered in researching my master's thesis, and I think it's apparent to many of us, is that this idea of a class, and I don't talk about it as much in this presentation, but also a racial distinction in who the commuter rail market is for, is actually quite foundational to the concept of what commuter rail means. There's this great paper from 1975 that I really like because it covers just how early you see these distinctions emerging. So as early as the 1880s in Chicago, one South Side woman who was complaining about the lack of heating straw on the floor of streetcars, all right, just think about what that means, observed to the Chicago Tribune that the rich have their Illinois Central commuter trains to ride. So you're seeing a huge class distinction between who rides the slow local transit and the quote unquote fast steam trains. Early streetcar routings took class into account. You have this quote, you can't mix silk stockings with picks and shovels. So you have the private companies that are making the decisions about routing and infrastructure explicitly taking division of services by class into account in their thinking. And I like the kind of highlighted phrase here so much, quote here so much that I actually used it to title my master's thesis. Just very briefly, I'm going to talk about the Fairmount line here in Boston. This is an example, if you know Boston, of a commuter rail line that runs through Boston's poorest, blackest neighborhoods, basically. And there's been a lot of activity around trying to modernize it, and services levels are gradually improving. But what's really interesting is to see how people in those neighborhoods think about the provision of service or lack thereof along that line. So Andrew Lai wrote his master's thesis for MIT a number of years ago about resident perceptions of the Fairmount line, and basically found that almost universally, folks in those neighborhoods that this line serves didn't think it was for them. They thought because it's commuter rail, even though it's got stations in our neighborhoods, it's essentially for suburbanites. And that's in part because of just how the class distinctions have always been. In part, it's because of what the schedules look like that were at the time very peak oriented. They're now more clock face around and regular throughout the day, although still not all that frequent. And that a lot of them didn't even know it existed. They would just assume that they would ride local buses and connect to the MBTA subway. One of my favorite things here is thinking about kind of mid-century associations of commuting and what that means. And there's this great paper from an Australian academic, Melissa Gregg, who looks at various media about commuting and traveling in media that recalls kind of mid-century America. Of course, very prominently, we have Mad Men here, which I will actually admit I have never watched a single episode of, but I know how iconic it is. And she's arguing that this kind of literal adoption of gray suits by the male leads of these books, movies, TV series is a visual clue as to how we should be thinking about these modes of transportation. And that this is about the experience, and the iconography symbolizes traveling by train into a work-focused urban core, while basically the women stay at home living a very domestic life. This is a gendered space, right? This is not not a space for everyone. It is a space for your corporate-oriented men who wear suits to work. And that tells us a lot about class distinctions as well, right? These characters all wear suits. So these are all nice stories, but show me the data, right? I want to turn to a landmark paper in the field of transit equity. And the quote I've pulled out here, that public transit agencies have perpetuated historic discriminatory patterns of service and fare structure inherited from private transit operators, and have in addition introduced new and perhaps more serious forms of inequity. This is by John Pucher in 1982. I think that's illustrative of the argument he makes throughout the paper. And I want to note the quote I pull out here doesn't quite capture the fierceness of his full argument. He goes on to basically charge transit agencies with repeatedly violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is kind of the governing law of transit equity, in their decisions around operating and capital investment. And I think it's important to think this paper was published in 1982, just as that transition from private to public ownership that I was talking about was really winding down. There were a few key decisions that were made right around that point, that he's identifying right then that in many cases, when you go from private to public ownership, it doesn't make things more equitable, right? The transition into public ownership is good in a lot of ways. It preserves the service, like Chistof was talking about, but it's not going to ensure that everybody is equally served by these services. They are going to remain the way they were. And that's because there's all of this history and inertia around how people had previously conceived commuter rail.
Great, thanks. And I want to take this point to transition to Giselle Hale, who, as a former mayor of Redwood City, can talk to us about how cities and places and people depend on these transit systems. What's your takeaway from the discussion about these international models and what would be useful for the future of cities and places and people? And I'll have some more questions for you, but first, tell us a little bit about kind of where you're coming from and how this potential transition would mean to a city on the line.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adina, for having me and for all of your advocacy on this issue. Chistof, I really enjoyed your use of the term transit spine along the peninsula. So hopefully what I'll be doing is sharing an example of how we could make that a very structurally sound spine. I also enjoyed the reference to Munich, where I'll be later this month or next month. And I actually spent my senior year of high school in Germany on a scholarship where I rode the trains every weekend because it was by far the cheapest way to get around and experience the country. And you're right, it is just, and I was in a rural area and they were very accessible. So I want to talk a bit today, and I'm the former mayor of Redwood City. I should mention our current mayor is an absolute transit champion, and he does sit on the current Caltrain board. So why have the former mayor present? Well, when you pull in a former mayor, you get to hear all of the unfiltered backstory. And that's what I'm here to provide. And a bit of the history of how we got to where we are today on our transit district, which is what I'm going to talk a bit about. So Redwood City, if for those of you who are not familiar with it, we're really known for being a regional leader in infill housing production for the region. Our most recent accolade, we were given the very prestigious pro-housing designation, which at the time was just one of 22 cities across the state. I think some additional cities have joined that distinction. We would love for all cities to join the distinction. That would mean that we're making great progress as a state. And then we've also been pursuing transportation very heavily. I'm going to talk about the centerpiece of those pursuits today. And I should mention that when the first version of the seamless transportation bill was coming forward, when David Chu was putting it forward, Redwood City was I believe the first city to sign on in support of that. So we really have leaned in on this idea of seamless transportation. So similar to Sandy, before I get started, I do want to ask you a question. I don't have any sort of fancy poll set up, so I just want you to think in your mind about what you think the answer is. Across our 2-county area, so we're in San Mateo, South of us is Santa Clara County. What do you think is the #1 action local policymakers could be taking to reduce climate emissions? Just think about that. So if you thought that it was building transit or electrifying buildings, you were actually wrong. It is building infill housing. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, Giselle, this is a transit panel. This is not a housing panel. You just love talking about housing so much. Yes, both are true. However, transit is what enables the density that we need to see in our region in order to achieve these higher rates of infill housing that so many of our housing goals are targeting us towards now. So in addition, I bring up climate because when you think about what's on the minds of your average city leader these days, the escalating costs related to storm, fire, and other climate-driven catastrophes are very much top of mind, are very costly, and are really starting to take up more and more of the mind share on a city council and a city staff. And so these issues are inextricably linked. And I want to start by saying that because you really can't talk about one without talking about how you're going to impact the other. There's loads of research on this academically. What I can say from a city perspective is that as we pursued densifying our downtown, we did our own research in the form of our Redwood City Moves transportation study. And what we found was as we added density downtown, we reduced car trips. So we found that those residents who had moved to our new infill housing were 50% less likely to drive a car themselves. And they had all sorts of other benefits related to water and carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. It was great. But we didn't know that until we did it. And what we realized is that despite having added this infill, we had actually overparked our downtown. And so this infill data comes from research that was done at the Cool Climate Network, which is a part of UC Berkeley. And it indeed shows that this is our #1 lever that we should be thinking about. And why I bring this up and why I think it's important is that when you talk about housing on a local level, one of the first objections you'll generally hear is, what about traffic? If you add more housing, you're going to add more traffic. And these are commonly linked themes. And so addressing transit long-term is also an important piece of addressing the housing issues. So I want you to sit back and hear from a venerable former mayor, I get to play that role, about how we came to creating what has now been officially called and adopted as the Redwood City Transportation District. So I can present this to you today, and it all sounds very premeditated, very strategic, but I can tell you that this came together very ad hoc. I remember my first weeks on the council in 2019, sitting down for a brief update meeting with Caltrain and learning more about their plans for Redwood City and how they envisioned us as a 4-train track station. Not long after that, we were approached by a developer and the landowner of our 1970s strip mall called Sequoia Station, which happens to be adjacent to where our current downtown transit center is. And they told us, hey, we want to redevelop this land. And hey, we heard Caltrain has some plans for you. Would you want to work something out? So we could see all of this happening. And we knew that they wanted to upgrade Redwood City to 4-train track station. And then we knew in the back of our minds, probably this would precipitate the need for grade separations. And so rather than taking each of these on their own, we decided to look at them holistically and see how we could help, by addressing all of them together, accelerate our overall plans for transportation in Redwood City. So I'm going to try to go through these relatively fast, but what are the goals at a high level? What were we trying to accomplish? Well, first of all, we knew that we needed a new station because we've had significant safety and access issues, and it's a very low amenity old school station. Second, I mentioned elevating the train tracks and the platform. We've had a number of safety issues with our tracks in Redwood City. There was an opportunity decades ago to do separation. The city leaders at the time sort of missed that window. Of course, everything has gone up significantly in cost. And so here we find ourselves today having to look to that. We also realized that in order to achieve the first two objectives, we were likely going to have to move the station. That's a non-trivial matter. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were addressing all the other needs in our community, housing, jobs. We know that putting jobs near transit as, if not more important than where the housing goes, because they will definitely take that train, neighborhood shopping amenities. And while we were at it, hey, let's improve biking and walking so that we can truly be a multimodal city. So this actually started before the slide says. Our first real discussion about this concept happened at an offsite in 2018. So, here we are 5 years later. And you can see how it took this journey through being adopted in November of last year. And now we've gone through the EIR process as well. And that was another huge advantage for those of you familiar with the entitlement process for large public projects. Because we created this district, we were able to use an umbrella environmental impact report, which we knew would help to accelerate as much as we could the timeline for these projects that would have their own funding challenges. So what did we have here? So first of all, with a 4-track station and longer platforms, we knew that our existing station would need to move, because we would have to avoid some of the recently constructed development. There was not space effectively. So the location that you see in the red stripes in this diagram with the bus bays is shown in black. And we also had a lot of safety concerns, as I had mentioned, at our crossings. And so we knew that this would also create further impacts. So we knew that we needed to raise those crossings. And we also knew that we needed additional infrastructure so that we could expand to a 4-train track station. And we knew that this was not just about Redwood City. This was actually a regional train service issue, because Redwood City would become a regional transit hub along that transportation spine, as Chistof called it. And so this was not just about doing our part for our residents, it was about doing our part to enable regional transportation.
All right. So this is the station is beautiful. I'd like to take us into some of the questions, and I want to start, Giselle, with you, because we had a couple of questions that, like, as a leader, in a city and part of the kind of network of leaders in the region, there were some people who asked, given these challenges and need for change, what do you think that would be helpful in terms of raising awareness and bringing about a call for change? Why do you have any insight into why things have been so slow to change, and any thoughts about what it would take to bring the change about?
Yeah, well, if I would have been allowed to continue my slides, I would have gone into the public process that we led and conducted. The reason I think Redwood City has been so successful at leading the way in housing, look, I was just on Instagram earlier today, and I saw that Millbrae is trying to convert a hotel, 99-room hotel, to homeless housing, right? 500 people showed up to protest that, which to me is a tragedy. We did 3 of those conversions in Redwood City, and we probably had maybe 5 people show up to protest them. I believe engagement has to happen early and often, and with some of your most critical opponents, and frequently, right? And so we've done that over time. The engagement process for this was incredibly robust, and it really shaped the project over time. It shaped the amenities such that the community felt they were gaining, not losing. They weren't losing. They were going to get more. I also think it's hard to do all of this at once. So one of the things we addressed early on, in fact, last year, was micromobility. A lot of people felt like the train was not accessible to them. Transit wasn't accessible to them. And so we did our first micromobility ordinance, and we almost in a pilot fashion started working with Bird It's been wildly successful. We've had 46,000 rides in a year. We're looking at having to expand service from 250 shuttle or what do they call them? Scooters to probably 400 so that we can address some additional neighborhoods. So I would say all of that is important to have those little wins along the way so that you know that this is really something that the community wants. And if it's not, how do you make it something that's meaningful for them and meets all their objectives?
Thanks. And for Chistof and Sandy, Giselle talked about the micromobility as something that really helps people get to and from the train. Do you have any other examples or ideas about helping people get to and from, as opposed to the standalone model of a commuter rail that people drive to the station?
I mean, this is part of our problem with commuter rail is we have focused so much on parking lots as a way to get commuter rail ridership. And they're actually one of the least efficient ways to do it. That if you look at how much space it takes to accommodate one park and ride rider, and the cost of that space, the cost of maintaining that space, we should be doing everything we can to get people to the station in other ways. I think local transit is a huge part of that. And what I could imagine on the peninsula is almost a 90-degree reorientation of the bus network. Like our most frequent bus on the peninsula runs parallel to Caltrain for its entire length. And the reason for that is the fare is lower on the bus and the service is more frequent on the bus. If Caltrain were more frequent and the fares were integrated, you could imagine a lot more buses that run east-west intersecting at Caltrain stations and feeding people into that spine. I think micromobility bikes are such an important part of this. If you go to suburban commuter rail stations in Tokyo, they have bike parking garages because of the sheer number of people who bike to those trains. And obviously the best last mile technology we have ever invented is a sidewalk. And we need really good sidewalks going to all of our stations. But this also goes to the point of land use, that everything we build right next to a station is somebody whose access to the station we don't need to figure out. Everybody who lives next to a station is right at the station. Everybody who works next to a station is right at the station. And all of the services we provide right next to stations allow people to live and do everything they need to do on transit. And I think that's also one of the challenges. Actually, I think the picture behind me right now is sadly indicative that I think one of the other issues on the peninsula is we need our job growth to also happen in places which are easily accessible to transit rather than depending on shuttle buses to get you there. A lot of times land use is really the first and most important tool to make the last mile work.
Yeah, thanks. And I was really happy that Giselle had also mentioned parking, which was such a key piece of what the transformation that Redwood City has been leading. So as Chistof was saying, integrated fares and is something that is very important to this transformation. So somebody asked a question, is Caltrain working on going to a distance-based fare? So the good news is that Caltrain and BART are kicking off a study, but unfortunately they're not planning on kicking off that study until 2024, and they're doing this very slowly. So yes, they are doing it, but they're doing it slowly. And I'd like to bring on my colleague Ian Griffiths with Seamless Bay Area, because someone said, well, what causes these barriers to having more integrated service and integrated fares? Ian, do you have any thoughts about that and what can be done to overcome those barriers?
There's a lot of barriers. Obviously, I think one of them is, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Adina, but one is just where funding comes from, and many of our local transit agencies, their funding mix is a significant amount of fares, especially for Caltrain. BART, the same applies. For many of our local transit agencies, a very significant amount from local sales taxes that are a countywide and very agency-specific measure. we don't have a very significant portion of state funding sources or regional sources. And with a regional source of funding and a statewide source of funding, you can attach conditions. And certainly when it's a new source of money, it's an opportunity to roll out policies like integrated fare. So there's an opportunity for the Bay Area, because we are talking finally about a regional funding measure. This is a major opportunity to fund the costs associated with fare integration and some of the other costs associated with integration in a way that's shared across the region and provides regional benefits. And so that's an important policy that we should really strongly be considering as we have this conversation about a regional funding measure. And that I'll just add that in the case of Zurich, and to use another foreign example, that was it was in the context of a regional ballot measure that funded the S-Bahn system. Part of that promise to voters was not only the building out of an electrified S-Bahn system, but the integration and the one ticket, one fare promise to voters that funded that very compelling promise, and that, you know, when that service opened, it really was a turning point in the history of Zurich region. That I think it should be an inspiring lesson for the Bay Area and for Caltrain.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And I think segueing from what Ian was talking about, one of the questions was about in the type of transformed and integrated system, who oversees that integrated system and who pays for it? And I think Ian gave some parts of perspective toward that answer. And I'm wondering whether Chistof has any additional perspective on that, who oversees and who pays for that, more integrated system with the formerly Commuter Rail as part of it.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories in this regard is actually talking to the people in Munich. And what's worth thinking about here is they implemented this fully integrated fare system with multiple operators, one of them being a federal government agency, namely Deutsche Bahn, in the 1970s. There were no clipper cards in the 1970s. This was an entirely paper-based system. So the question you might then ask is, how in the world do the agencies know if somebody bought a paper-based ticket or a paper-based monthly pass, how many people rode each mode? And the answer is they didn't know. They just met once a year and decided what the split of the fare revenue between the agencies would be, because that's what it took to make this system work. And they had decided they were going to make this system work because it was what was better for the passengers and better for the region. So I think this takes that kind of attitude. As long as agencies think of themselves only instead of thinking about the system as a whole, you don't get there. And the nice thing is a lot of this stuff does financially work out. Like you can say, if we drop, especially off-peak, if we drop Caltrain fares to be the same as bus fares, isn't that a huge revenue loss for Caltrain? Well, no, you're filling up seats that are empty otherwise. And guess what? If you do that, you can actually operate less of that parallel bus service, which is more expensive to operate. So now let's start thinking about how this impacts operations budgets. And it does mean all of the agencies have to sit down together, and maybe some of the revenue flows in different directions than it's flowed in the past. But in the end, we're actually talking about operating a network that's more efficient than the network we have right now. And I think you can still use smart peak, off-peak, whatever fare pricing you do to manage that well. Frankly, the other thing you can do is charge for parking. That I think a lot of times the best solution in these things is actually jack up the parking cost and lower the transit fare, because again, you're actually incentivizing people to show up to show up to the station with something other than a car.
Mm-hmm. Which I think points to another set of policies that Redwood City started when Giselle was on council and mayor, and will be continuing, is charging for parking, and then how to use that revenue to improve sustainable transportation. I want to have a question for Giselle on this family of topics, because one of the things that Caltrain and the transit agencies are wrestling with now is moving from a single agency passes to all agency pass. And And this is something I think Redwood City has dealt with, where in doing housing development near transit, the question came up, well, should we give the residents a bus pass or a train pass? And so if Redwood City had a choice, would it prefer giving a bus pass, a train pass, or an all agency pass, and why?
Well, obviously, we want the all agency pass. We do have TDMs, transit demand management plans in place with so first of all, parking, because there was a question in the chat about that. We started reducing or eliminating parking minimums much earlier than like the state, because we did realize we had overparked our downtown. And what a wasted opportunity for that possible infill space. One of the projects I'm most proud of from my time on council is we're actually in the process of converting a parking lot next to our library into a park, which just to me is like the full, 180. For us, bringing a lot of housing of all income levels into the downtown was important. So we have some tremendous wins with affordable housing at all levels. We also have an ordinance that favors people who live or work in Redwood City, because we had found through a study that we were housing the lower income residents of cities who were unwilling to build housing. And so we knew that it would help us to build more housing if we could show that it would help more people stay in Redwood City to work or to live. But that said, not everybody can. And then moving people around becomes important, especially when we have not prioritized parking. We did just raise parking last year because we realized that we were not charging for parking during some of the peak times people were parking in Redwood City. And as we know, because Redwood City developed our downtown, which is right behind me here, this is one of the Theater Way, which is now a pedestrian zone. Was excited to cast that vote. So there's no cars that go down there anymore. People come from all over the Bay Area to go to our downtown, to go to our movie theater, to eat at our restaurants. They're coming from Portola Valley and Atherton. So why were the residents of Redwood City subsidizing their parking? So we moved to a better system for that and want to be able to use funds to provide those types of benefits to residents. I will also add, there was a great community-led initiative to get more passes into the hands of high school students. Redwood City has Sequoia High School, which feeds a number of cities up and down the peninsula. A lot of these kids were taking cars, and so making it a normal part of childhood to take the bus or hop on the train. I lead the bike bus for my daughter's school. These are all things we've moved away from that we want to start to bring back because they make your community more livable and more vibrant. So we've really embraced all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And speaking of all the people that make our communities livable and vibrant, this is what happens when Caltrain has made passes available to people of all income levels. Through that program, we have these are the job titles: baking instructor, cashier, lab technician, clerk, detox counselor, housekeeping person. I have heard from a Caltrain board member this year that they believe that Caltrain's audience will remain high-income commuters in perpetuity, but this is actually not the case. And this is part of the transformation, is enabling a diversity of people to use our public transportation system. It is 2:00, so I want to thank the panelists. Thank everyone for really insightful questions that we got to some of, but not all of, and leave you with some key opportunities and decisions over the next couple of years that are going to be really instrumental in bringing about these changes in our area. And for those of you that are outside of the Bay Area and elsewhere, watch for the things that are happening in your area. Caltrain's schedule for electric service, they're going to start talking about this in September. So if you want to see that more frequent all day regular schedule, start to speak up this fall. The decision about expanding a pilot for that all agency transit pass is going to happen in this fall. And there's some nervousness and concerns about the downside. So if you are optimistic about the upside of all agency transit paths. There's going to be an opportunity. The Bay Area is working on a regional transportation funding measure. And so if we want that to fund frequent all-day well-connected service with integrated and affordable fares, it's going to be really important to speak up. Caltrain Electric Service is going to come out next fall. And at the very same time, there's going to be free transfers with the next generation payment system. So that's going to be another opportunity for transformation. It's going to be moving forward. And that regional funding measure is expected to be on the ballot in 2026. So there's a lot that folks can do, here in the Bay Area to pay attention, to speak up for the transformation here. And there's other things that are happening around the state that we don't have time to get into, and even around the country to help move this kind of transportation forward in a variety of different locations. Hopefully that this case study can be informative to you. So thanks everyone for attending. We will be sending out the slides and the recording, and looking forward to working together to bring about the transformation. Thanks.